Okay, well, thank you very much, Bertram. Thank you for inviting me. This title is a bit misleading. This says the ethics and governance of robotics and AI. This has become a truly vast subject area. It's not something that's going to get covered in 15 minutes or even 15 hours the way things are going these days. But what I am going to do in this talk is I'm going to give you a very brief introduction to a new initiative. Ethics, law, and policy, they often get conflated. And many people act as if they are the same thing, and often, particularly in the law circles, you would think that policy and ethics are just totally subsumed within the law, but that's very seldom the case. And various ones of us get identified with being with different fields. So, for example, for the past 15 years, I've generally been looked at as associated with the ethics perspective, but more recently my work is almost totally focused on policy issues. So what you learn as you get into these fields is they become very different perspectives on often very much the same challenges. But certainly there are issues such as lethal autonomous weapon systems in which the three are so entangled that it's pretty impossible to fully separate one from the other. With this rapid speed up in the rate of scientific discovery and the rate of technological innovation, there has been what's sometimes referred to as the pacing problem, that policy and ethics is not at all able to keep up with this development. And it's sometimes referred to as the growing gap between emerging technologies and their legal ethical oversight. When you look at existing governance frameworks, or particularly government frameworks, I'm going to make the distinction between the government word, which is usually about laws and regulations, and governance, which can float over into other areas, and we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go along. The existing government frameworks for the oversight of emerging technologies in general there's just a total mismatch between them and these emerging technologies that are developing so rapidly. Furthermore, we have all kinds of laws and regulations in place that were about older technologies and don't become very well applied to new technologies. So until very recently, we had TSCA, the Toxic Substance and Control Act, which talked about toxicity largely in terms of quantities of toxic substances. That made it totally unapplicable to nanotoxins. And that's been just adjusted in recent years. But we also have the problem that there are so many technologies in play now that legislators find it almost impossible to keep up with them. There's a resistance to putting new regulations in place, as you all know, and we're dismantling God knows how much of the regulations that we have in place. And there's seldom funding so that the regulators can even stay on top of technologies that they would like to stay on top of. So about 6 years ago now, Gary Marchant and I were together. Some of you may know Gary. He's the director of the Center for Law and Innovation at the Sandra Day O'Connor School of Law at Arizona State University, and perhaps one of the leading figures on the governance of emerging technologies. He and I were sitting there lamenting this mismatch, and we just shifted the conversation 180 degrees and said, well, if we had our druthers, what would we put in place? And what evolved from that conversation is what we initially referred to as governance coordinating committees. We developed this idea for new agile governance, and we had, as academics do, as scholars do, we produced a series of articles and presented this at various conferences. So to give you the quickest sense of what we're talking about here, we're talking about putting in place an issues manager that coordinates the activities of the various stakeholders. It would be engaged in comprehensive monitoring, flagging issues and gaps, helping sort out who is taking responsibilities for those issues and which ones were not, responsibility was not taken for particularly. They would try and find solutions within the robust set of available mechanisms, and they'd be mandated to avoid regulation whenever possible. So they would favor soft governance. and technological solutions where those are truly feasible. For those of you for whom the soft governance term is new, that largely refers to industry standards, laboratory practices and procedures, insurance policies, a whole plethora of different mechanisms. The difficulty is that soft governance can be very flexible. It can respond to changing conditions, but it's usually very poor in that it doesn't have good enforcement regimes behind it. But the idea here is to put in place governance that is nimble, flexible, adaptive, and lean. Now, any new strategy that you want to implement, any new approach to governance will have its implementation challenges. There's questions of authority and legitimacy. Would it have adequate influence? How would the members and administrators be selected? Could it establish credibility? Should it be governmental or private? It can perhaps insulate itself from political influence if it was private, but it would probably have less influence. Or perhaps we want a mixture of the two. How would it be funded? To whom would it be accountable? Now, the collection of implementation challenges may make some of you think this is just too complicated, or perhaps hopelessly naive in the present political context. And no doubt a few of you have thought this is both complicated and hopelessly naive. Nevertheless, something like this is needed. And therefore, Gary and I recommended already 4 years ago that we should put 2 pilot projects in place, one for AI and robotics and another for gene editing and synthetic biology. And we recommended these because they are fields that were coming on fast, but they were largely unencumbered by rules and regulations. Now, think about 4 years ago, and now think about a mere 2 years ago. I would say 2 years ago, for most of you in this room, was the first time you ever heard about deep learning algorithms, and it was about the first time you ever heard of CRISPR-Cas9, this new radical gene editing technique. So 2 technologies that have suddenly made these fields explode in terms of what their societal impact could be. But then, even though we had originally conceived of this approach in the American context, there were also a lot of international coordination issues. Issues of harmonizing approaches from different countries, dealing with differing values. Most of you know that Canada and the EU, for example, have rejected genetically modified foods. Gene editing is something that will be an issue across the board unless we can put international oversight in place. Some countries function under a precautionary principle. And even though there are differing values, there are also those shared concerns. So there are technologies such as geoengineering, which is, for those of you who are unaware of the term, it's technological ways to mitigate the effects of global climate change. And considering these international coordination issues, it was clear to me that if we started a project just within the United States, that wouldn't necessarily translate well to other societies, particularly non-democratic societies such as China, that may be just as important in the decision-making process as we move toward putting standards in place. For a few years, I sat around and said, somebody should do this, and people kept saying, this is a really good idea, but nobody was coming forward. And then one day, about 9 months ago, I woke up, and I said, oh, guess what? You're it. So, together with Anja Kaspersen, a woman from Norway who has tremendous diplomatic experience and experience in the international policy space and security community, together with her and in concert with the Hastings Center and the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs, we have initiated this project called Building Global Infrastructure to ensure that artificial intelligence and robotics are beneficial. So this will be the pilot project, and it will have both an international component, hopefully complemented by site centers, projects that are more focused on national and local concerns in the EU, in the United States, in China, in Korea, in many other regions. The idea here is to put in place a multi-stakeholder forum that functions as a good faith broker with the public, with international bodies such as the UN, the IEEE, the International Committee for the Red Cross, the World Economic Forum, all of which, by the way, are already partnering with us in this project, and industry leaders, legislators and regulatory authorities, scholars and representatives of civil society. And then there are the robotics-specific and AI-specific organizations, often professional societies, and of course the media. But if technological development is truly accelerating as it clearly appears to be, this need for foresight, planning, and oversight become truly pressing. So that's it for my presentation. Thank you very much. And I'm afraid we have no timer working here.
Did I not press the start button?
Yeah.
Well, you were self-governing, so I appreciate that.
Some robots can be self-governing, right?
So we have maybe time for a couple of questions, and if the panel members could take their seats, then we don't have much of a transition right after.
Okay, no questions?
Anybody would like to receive a throw?
We have one here.
I was just curious.
Wait, wait.
Thank you. I love this. I'm going to make one over the summer.
Yeah, that is so cool.
With Arduino. Like, this should be easy to make. So I was just wondering, can you give us some more information on this building global infrastructures part? Like, how are you organizing this? Who's involved? Right? Like, how is this going to happen? It sounds really exciting. How do people get involved?
Yeah, well, in one sense, that was part of why I gave the presentations. I hope some of you will be interested in being involved. But we're starting with just establishing relationships with all the different bodies that are suddenly jumping into the space. Now, the reality is there's a lot of them. There's the very explicit groups like the Partnership in AI, which is the big corporations, Google, Facebook, Microsoft. And there's some smaller groups like the Foundation for Responsible Robotics that have just come into being. There are all kinds of industry players, and suddenly, as I said, the UN, the International Committee of the Red Cross, these are all groups that are not explicitly about this, but they're realizing how much these issues impact their own missions. So it's starting with really our networking or functioning as a link between those various organizations. And I think that's what I realized when I woke up in the morning, that I was actually a little bit better networked to the vast plethora of different kinds of bodies and people that had moved into this space than others. And that's partially because my concern has been breaking silos. Most people in this space live within their own silos, whether those are technical or policy or social science, academic oriented. And I'm not trying to say those silos are necessarily small. This is a fairly big silo that we have represented in this room today. So it's starting with that, but it's moving in the area of trying to figure out who's taking responsibility for what. So the IEEE, for example, jumped in and has had this meeting with over 150 different experts in various ethical issues. They've already produced a 90-page document. They're about to add another 50 or 60 pages onto that. That's really too much. But the IEEE really does want to go beyond that and jump into the policy space itself. So they're really going beyond setting standards, and they want to think about policy. But the reality is, these are too many areas. I mean, AI is going to, and robotics, they're going to affect everything over the next 10 or 20 years. So you can't have standards for everything, and it's not clear what the IEEE will take responsibility for. So in concert with them, we're going to help them clarify that process. We're putting together various smaller expert forums in which we bring together key people to think through different issues, such as what really works for an NGO in an international space, or again, what might be the areas of concern that a particular body thinks it can make a difference on, and where can it make a difference. And we hope to be moving toward establishing a very small NGO ourselves that truly does function as a good faith broker. Will it? I don't know. I mean, this is a pretty daunting task, but somebody's got to try and do it.